Imagine living in an ancient city thousands of years ago. You walk through a crowded marketplace. Merchants are shouting. Soldiers are passing through. Foreign travelers are spending their money. Taverns are full of customers. And somewhere nearby, people are paying for sex. But here's the mystery. Who opened the first brothel in human history? The surprising answer is that we don't know. There is no surviving ancient document that says, this person invented the brothel. And historians now believe the story was probably much less dramatic than that. The brothel was not invented in one moment. It gradually emerged as cities became larger, richer, and more commercial. To understand why, we have to go back to ancient Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia produced some of the world's earliest cities, writing systems, legal codes, and complex economies. By the time of Babylon, people were already living in a world where strangers could meet, trade, rent spaces, buy food, drink beer, and exchange money. And once you have a large city full of strangers, something important changes. People no longer need to know each other personally to conduct business. That applies to almost everything: food, clothing, lodging, entertainment, and eventually, sex. Ancient Mesopotamian texts contain references to women who have traditionally been identified as prostitutes. One important word is the Akkadian term harimtu. But even here, historians disagree. The traditional interpretation connects harimtu with prostitution. Assyriologist Julia Asante challenged that interpretation, arguing that the word could refer more broadly to an unmarried or socially independent woman. That disagreement matters because it shows how difficult it is to reconstruct ancient prostitution. We cannot simply find a word and assume it means prostitute. We have to understand the entire social context. There were also taverns. Taverns were commercial establishments where people drank beer, ate, and socialized. Some ancient evidence connects them with sexual activity. But a tavern was not automatically a brothel. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make when talking about ancient history. They see women working in a tavern and immediately imagine a brothel. The reality was probably much more complicated. Sex could happen in places that were not specifically designed for prostitution. And this gives us our first major clue. The earliest commercial sex probably didn't require a building called a brothel. A customer could meet a sex worker in a tavern, lodging house, street, private home, or another commercial space. The specialized brothel came later, and one of the most famous stories about its origins comes from ancient Athens. According to later writers, the Athenian lawgiver Solon established inexpensive public brothels in the 6th century BCE. The story says that Athens had large numbers of young men, and Solon's solution was to make prostitutes commercially available. It is a fascinating story. But there is a problem. Modern historian Delphine Leao examined the evidence and concluded that the tradition that Solon personally established official brothels is probably false. In other words, one of history's most famous inventors of the brothel may never have done it at all. So why did the story become so famous? Because prostitution really was deeply integrated into the Athenian economy. Historian Edward Cohen, in Athenian Prostitution, The Business of Sex, approaches prostitution from an economic perspective rather than treating it simply as a question of morality. His argument helps us understand something important. Prostitution was a commercial activity. There were customers, there were workers, there were people who managed establishments, and there was money flowing through the system. In other words, by Classical Athens, sex had clearly become part of the urban marketplace. But there is another misconception we need to remove. You may have heard that ancient temples were filled with prostitutes performing sacred prostitution. This story is famous, especially because the Greek historian Herodotus described a supposed Babylonian ritual involving women and foreign men. For a long time, historians repeated this as evidence of temple prostitution. Modern scholarship is much more cautious. Researchers such as Stephanie Lynn Budin have argued that the supposed institution of widespread sacred prostitution is based on weak or misinterpreted evidence. Other scholars have defended parts of the ancient evidence and argued that Herodotus should not simply be dismissed. So the honest conclusion is not that sacred prostitution definitely existed everywhere. It is that the evidence is heavily disputed. And that is important because historians have sometimes turned uncertain evidence into historical fact. Then we reach the place where the evidence becomes much stronger: Pompeii. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried Pompeii. The disaster preserved an extraordinary snapshot of Roman urban life. And inside Pompeii was a building now known as the Lupanar. This is the closest thing we have to a clearly identifiable purpose-built brothel from Greco-Roman antiquity. Archaeologist Alison Glazebrook notes that physical evidence for prostitution is difficult to identify across the ancient Greek and Roman world. Pompeii is exceptional because its architecture, graffiti, and other evidence provide a much stronger case. The building contained tiny rooms along a corridor. There were masonry beds, erotic paintings decorated the walls, and graffiti provide clues about the people who used the building. But even here, the story is darker than the romantic image of an ancient business. Roman prostitution was closely connected with slavery. Research by Sarah Levin Richardson at the University of Washington has shown how inscriptions from Pompeii reveal connections between prostitution and enslaved people. Her research found that the term verna, commonly referring to someone born into slavery within a household, appeared repeatedly in prostitution-related evidence at Pompeii. So when we imagine the first brothel, we shouldn't picture a clever entrepreneur suddenly opening a business. The reality was probably much more gradual. First came cities. Cities created markets. Markets brought strangers together. Strangers created demand for temporary services. And people discovered that sex, like food, entertainment, lodging, and transportation, could be exchanged for money. Eventually, some of those transactions became organized. A tavern could become associated with prostitution. A private house could provide rooms. A manager could control several workers. A price could become standardized. And eventually, an entire building could be designed specifically for commercial sex. That is what makes the Pompeii example so important. It shows us the final stage of a process that probably began much earlier. And there is one more important lesson. Historians cannot simply look at an ancient building and declare it a brothel. Archaeologist Alison Glazebrook has emphasized how difficult these identifications are because brothels, taverns, inns, and ordinary houses could share similar architectural features. A room with a bed doesn't prove prostitution. Erotic art doesn't prove prostitution. Even graffiti may not tell us exactly what happened inside. Historical evidence has to be combined. Architecture, texts, inscriptions, graffiti, artifacts, and social context. That is why we probably will never know the name of the person who created the world's first brothel. The building may have disappeared thousands of years ago. The name of its owner may never have been written down, and perhaps it wasn't even recognized as a brothel by the people using it. Because the institution probably wasn't invented all at once. It evolved. As humans moved from small communities into enormous cities, new kinds of commercial relationships appeared. And prostitution became one of them. So the real answer to the question, who invented the first brothel, is surprisingly simple. Probably nobody. There was no single inventor. The brothel was the result of urban civilization slowly turning human desires into organized commerce. And by the time we can clearly see a purpose-built brothel at Pompeii, the business of selling sex was already centuries, perhaps much longer, into its history. The first brothel is lost, but the forces that created it are still recognizable. Cities, money, migration, inequality, demand, and the ancient human ability to turn almost anything into a market. That may be the most fascinating part of the story. The first brothel wasn't really invented. It evolved alongside the city itself.